Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with Part 6, The Colonization Scheme, from America's Assignment with Destiny by Manly P. Hall. The Colonization Scheme. The political intrigues with Queen Elizabeth had inherited from Henry VIII plagued Her Majesty's advisors throughout her long reign. Henry rebelled against the papacy, ousted its clergy, closed its monastic houses, confiscated its properties, and established the Church of England. Spain, motivated by both religious and secular considerations, was resolved to control England. The Spanish ambassador at the court of the Tudors was the moving spirit behind an elaborate program of espionage, and all that he could learn, glean, or deduce was dispatched post haste to his royal master, the King of Spain. While serving his diplomatic apprenticeship at the court of Navarre, Bacon had been initiated into the new libertarianism represented throughout Europe by secret societies of intellectuals dedicated to civil and religious freedom. He returned to England fully aware of the intentions of Philip II, the Spanish king. Later, when the movement was propitious, he threw the weight of his literary group with the English colonization plan for America in order to prevent Spanish domination of the New World. The same political considerations apparently also induced him to develop Freemasonry as a further bulwark against the encroachments of the Spanish plot. Cherishing as he did the dream of a great commonwealth in the New Atlantis, Bacon was resolved to prevent his plan from being frustrated by a dominant clergy, supported by an entrenched aristocracy. It was necessary for Bacon to conceal both his purposes and the machinery for their fulfillment from the Spanish spies. If the project was prematurely revealed, it could precipitate a desperate political situation, with many countries secretly sympathizing with the cause of Spain, and Elizabeth's claim to the throne questioned because of Henry's numerous divorces. It was impossible to use such controversial channels as were provided by an uneasy government. Bacon protected both his cause and his country by acting privately and maturing his schemes within the hollowed walls of the Inns of Court, there in the sanctuary of the martyred Templars, who had earlier felt the full weight of ecclesiastical displeasure. He labored industriously to fashion wings for the White House of Britain. The rapid progress of England in the second half of the 16th and the first half of the 17th centuries was not only due to the appearance of a select coterie of wits, but also to the more liberal atmosphere which resulted from Henry's religious housecleaning. After the Armada, the issues were partly clarified, but it still remained vital to protect and enlarge the English interest in the Western Hemisphere. Incidentally, the ships of the Armada carried 90 Spanish Inquisitioners with all the paraphernalia of their office, ready to set up the Inquisition in conquered England. The Pope had already claimed the three Americas for the Church, but the English colonizers were resolved to dispute this claim with every resource at their disposal. The first permanent English settlement in North America was established at Jamestown, Virginia, on May 14, 1607. Earlier attempts resulted only in the naming of the region, which was called Virginia in honor of Queen Elizabeth. In 1609, Sir George Somers was appointed governor of the colony of Virginia. He sailed for the New World with dignity appropriate to his office, but his arrival was delayed when his ship foundered on the Hog Islands. Later, he was able to victual 2 pinnaces with prime pork and to proceed on his journey. The Hog Islands, so named because of the wild swine that infested them, was renamed the Summer Islands in honor of Sir George's impromptu visit. Ultimately, however, these islands were called the Bermudas, after the Spanish navigator, Juan Bermudez. The Summer Islands shilling. In 1609, James I granted a charter to the Bermuda Company, and in 1612, Richard Moore and 60 colonists from Virginia settled on one of the islands. Later, in 1616, Captain John Smith appointed Master Daniel Tucker as governor of Bermuda. The same year, a series of coins was struck for the use in the Bermudas. The history of this coinage is extremely obscure. The hog money, as it is often called, was of brass and in 3 denominations. The shilling of this issue bears on the obverse the legend, Summer Islands, surrounding the figure of a wild boar. Above the boar is the numeral 12, signifying 12 pence. There is no date. The reverse of the coin is a ship under full sail. The wild boar on this coinage carries the definite impression of being a heraldic device. It is identical in drawing with the crest of Lord Bacon, even to the jaunty curl of its porcine tail. According to the meager records in the British Museum, this coinage was forbidden by James I to be exported. It seems strange that the hog money should have been regarded so unfavorably by the king. Why did James on 2 separate occasions act so strenuously to prevent the circulation of this coinage? The Encyclopedia Britannica, 1946, intimates that the coins were struck in America, but numismatic catalogs describe them as made for America. From the evidence of the coins themselves, it would seem that the hog money was a definite landmark, bearing witness to the operations of the secret society directing the early colonization program. The adventures of Sir George Somers were quickly adapted to high drama by the literary workshops at Gray's Inn. The most obvious example of their ingenuity was the Tempest. This play first appeared about 1.5 years after the governor had been shipwrecked. According to the chronological chart of the Shakespearean plays, the Tempest was first acted in 1611, was played a second time in 1613, but was not published until the Great Folio of 1623. It is supposed that the play was written between 1608 and 1610, but there is no data as to whether or not it was among those rewritten before final publication. The character of Prospero, magician, philosopher, and Duke of Milan, is believed to be based upon a historical person whose name was Prospero Colonna. It is interesting that Columbus usually signed himself Colon, and that Lord Bacon has been referred to as the Little Columbus of literature. The Tempest also introduces an honest old counselor by name Gasanlo, who seems dedicated to a utopian mood. He refers to the magic isle as a commonwealth and explains that if he had a plantation there, a term used in describing colonial grants in America, he would design it along communal lines, concluding, all things in common, nature should produce, without sweat or endeavor. Treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine would I not have, but nature should bring forth, of its own kind, all poison, all abundance, to feed my innocent people. The patrons of the Virginia Company included Lord Southampton, and those two, that incomparable pair, William, Earl of Pembroke, and Philip, Earl of Montgomery, to whom the first folio of Shakespeare was dedicated. These excellent gentlemen also permitted the use of their names as patrons of that company of actors, which included William Shakespeare, a tight little corporation to say the least. So elaborate a plan would not have been necessary had the colonization program involved nothing more than the granting of land to royal favorites. It makes little practical difference whether the flora or fauna of the Tempest resembles the Bermudas, or as Dr. Hale suggests, corresponds more closely with the Cuttyhunk Island off the coast of Massachusetts. The opponents of the Bermudian hypothesis insist that the play would have mentioned the wild hogs, had these islands been the locale of the story. If Bacon and his society were involved in the project, it would scarcely have been advisable for them to emphasize the hog symbol, which had already been used with discretion on several occasions. They could not afford to tie the Shakespearean productions so obviously with their scheme. They were satisfied to leave their mark and seal on the emblematic coinage. The Brave New World, referred to by Miranda, is certainly American and not some insignificant island. Prospero is the magician of the New Age, the exponent of the Baconian method. He binds the elements to his service, and the story of his adventures is an improvisation upon the grand theme of the utopias. It was also in this brave new world that he buried his magical staff and drowned his book. That is, concealed in appropriate places the formulas which were the secret of his power. Thomas Jefferson examined the repositories of the Bacon group in colonial America, checked their contents, and caused them to be resealed for future ages. Several attempts have been made to locate these philosophical tombs, including excavations in England, Newfoundland, and Virginia. What is believed to be an important Baconian vault was located with the help of coated tombstones in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1938. After his banishment from public life, Bacon muses thus upon the philosophical advantages of political decline. Methinks they are resembled by those of Sir Thomas Somers, who being bound by his employment to another coast, was by Tempest cast upon the Bermudas, and therefore a shipwrecked man made full discovery of a new temperate, fruitful region, which none had before inhabited, and which mariners, who had only seen its rocks, had esteemed an inaccessible and enchanted place. In his advice to Sir George Villiers, Bacon expresses the same sentiments which had been incorporated in the broadsides of the Council for Virginia. According to Alexander Brown, he may have taken these ideas from those broadsides, or he may have been one of the original authors of them, as he was a member of that council. The same author was so impressed by Bacon's references to Tempest and the inaccessible and enchanted Bermudas that he asked, may not Bacon have aided Shakespeare in compiling some of his plays? Bacon always had a fancy for such things. Dr. Brown also mentions the Bacon family in America. Nothing that Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States, was doubly descended from this family. It is not without reason that Lord Bacon, who has been called the moving spirit in the colonization scheme, included Christopher Columbus as one of the great inventors. Judge Brown writes of Bacon's participation in the settlement of Newfoundland. It was entirely due to the great chancellor's influence that the king granted the advances and issued the charters to Bacon and his associates in Guy's Newfoundland Company. The colonial state calendar contains the following extract: a patent to Henry, Earl of Northampton, Sir Francis Bacon, and others, for the colony or plantation in Newfoundland, from 46 to 52 north latitude, together with the seas and islands lying within 10 leagues of the coast. The same notes, a letter is mentioned from John Smith to Lord Bacon, enclosing description of New England, the extraordinary profits arising from the fisheries and great facilities for plantation. Stamp of Newfoundland, issued to commemorate the tercentenary of the colonization scheme and Lord Bacon, its guiding spirit. William Hepworth Dixon of the Inner Temple, writing in 1861, makes several important observations concerning the settlement of the New World. A few fragments will indicate the direction of his thinking. In no history of America, in no life of Bacon, have I found one word to connect him with the plantation of that great republic. Yet, like Raleigh and Delaware, he takes an active share in the labors, a conspicuous part in the sacrifices through which the foundations of Virginia and the Carolinas are first laid. Like men of far less note who have received far higher honors in America, Bacon pays his money into the great company and takes office in its management as one of the council. To his other glories, therefore, must be added that of a founder of new states. All generous spirits rush to the defense of Virginia. Bacon joins the company with purse and voice. Montgomery, Pembroke, and Southampton, the noble friends of Shakespeare, join it. A fleet, commanded by Gates and Somers, sails from Thames to meet on its voyage at sea the singular and poetic storms and trials which add to the Bermudas to our empire and the Tempest to our literature. 175 years after Walter Raleigh laid down his life in Palace Yard for America, his illustrious blood paid for by Gondomar in Spanish gold, the citizens of Carolina, framing for themselves a free constitution, remembered the man to whose genius they owed their existence as a state. They called the capital of their country Raleigh. The United States can also claim among their muster roll of founders the no less noble name of Francis Bacon. Will the day come when, dropping such feeble names as Troy and Syracuse, the people of the great republic will give the august and immortal name of Bacon to one of their splendid cities? Sir Walter Raleigh, from the portrait in the first edition of his great folio volume, The History of the World. Sir Walter Raleigh, a distinguished member of the Baconian circle, made the mistake of confiding his private plans for his South American expedition to the king. James promised to keep the secret with his honor, but hastened to whisper it in the ear of Count Gondomar. The Spanish, properly forewarned, had a strong force waiting for Raleigh at the mouth of the Orinoco, and in the fighting that followed, Raleigh's son was killed. James, who was to blame for the whole sorry business, promised Gondomar that Raleigh would be publicly executed. But even the popular account of the knight's death is false. Under such conditions, it would have been madness to preserve the papers of any significant political project. That which was intentionally concealed, even from the records of state, cannot easily be recovered after so long a time. It was an axiom of that day that a wise man was like a trunk with a double bottom. When first opened, the trunk must seem to be empty. Only those of kindred spirit could know that a man's character had a secret compartment. James Speeding, an outstanding authority on Bacon's life, writes, "We learn incidentally from one of Bacon's apophthegms that soon after he became Lord Keeper, which should be shortly before Raleigh sailed, he had a long conversation with him in Gray's Inn Walks. We are not told what the subject was, but it must have been interesting, and was probably important, for it was then that he kept the Earl of Exeter so long waiting upstairs." Benjamin Disraeli gave some attention to that extraordinary volume, The History of the World, which Sir Walter Raleigh is supposed to have written during his confinement in the Tower of London. Disraeli, whose scholarship equipped him to weigh the difficulties of so vast a project, concluded that Raleigh, whose natural inclinations and opportunities belied the work, must have received considerable assistance from other wits. He listed several candidates for the honors of co-authorship, but if Disraeli stated the dilemma skillfully, his solutions are inconclusive. The only names of interest which he advanced were the Earl of Northumberland and Ben Jonson. Bacon visited Raleigh during his imprisonment, and the friendship between the two men was sufficiently founded upon previous efforts which Bacon had made to cement a genuine alliance between Raleigh and the unfortunate Earl of Essex. Ben Jonson acted as an intermediary and agent extraordinary on several occasions. It will be remembered that Jonson was at Stratford on that festive evening, which is said to have contributed to the Broad's demise. If Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek, it is unlikely that Raleigh had more Hebrew. The first edition of the History of the World is embellished with numerous emblems and devices belonging to the Baconian group. The title page has been a subject of controversy for centuries. Ben Jonson, referring to Sir Walter Raleigh, told Drummond, "The best wits in England were employed in making his history." Bacon became a member of the Virginia Company in 1609. The charters of that year and of 1612, drafted by Sandys, were prepared for the king's signature by Sir Henry Hobart and Sir Francis Bacon. To Bacon's interest in the colonies, testimony is bore by William Strachey in the dedication. dated 1618, of a manuscript of his History of Travel into Virginia Britannica, your lordship ever proving yourself a most noble favorer of the Virginia plantation, being from the beginning, with other lords and earls, of the principal counsel applied, to propagate and guide yet. One of the reasons why there is so much difficulty in tracing Bacon's activities in connection with the plantation is that the records of the Privy Council to the year 1613 were destroyed by fire at Whitehall in 1618. Incidentally, the boundaries of the original Virginia colony extended to the west coast of California. Charles Miles Gailey divides the group, instrumental in the foundation of the Virginia Company of London, into two sections: the Liberals or Patriots, and the Imperialists, who supported the king in reserving to the crown the right to form the government of the colonies and plantations. This conflict was the real source of the Revolution of 1775, which resulted in the complete independence of the American colonies. Among the Liberals, Gailey included Christopher Brooke and John Selden. They were both, in their hours of ease, poets after a fashion, members of the pastoral coterie of the Inns of Court. Brooke's bosom friend was the poet Donne. He was also intimate with Shakespeare's fellow dramatist, Johnson and Drayton, and his epic dramatic admirer, Davies of Hereford. Gailey shows the usual systematic indifference to Bacon's part in the colonization plan, and the few references which he makes to his lordship are consistently derogatory. He does, however, mention that Bacon, in his essay of Plantation, which was not published until after the great Chancellor's death, appeared to agree with the practical phase of the Liberals' policy. Gailey says, Bacon may have collaborated with Sandys, but his interest in the colonies was romantic and always for the glorification of the crown. In a speech given at Gray's Inn Hall, an American, the Honorable James Beck, remarked that the two charters of government, which were the beginning of constitutionalism in America, and therefore the germ of the Constitution of the United States, were drawn up by Lord Bacon. He added that Bacon, the immortal treasurer of Gray's Inn, visioned the future and predicted the growth of America in the memorable words, "The kingdom now first his majesty's. Time hath gotten a lot or portion in the New World by the plantation of Virginia and the Summer Islands. And certainly it is with the kingdom of the earth, as it is in the kingdom of heaven. Sometimes a grain of mustard seed proves a great tree." From Casey's Spara Civitatis, Queen Elizabeth as the presiding genius of the sphere of moral virtues. In a speech touching the recovery of drowned mineral works, prepared for the Parliament by the Viscount of St. Albans, the Lord High Chancellor of England indicated his intention of making an immediate and practical application of his philosophical theory. Bacon's words should be carefully studied, for here is a remarkable example of double meaning. He says, "For by this unchangeable way, my lords, have I proposed to erect the academical fabric of the islands of Solomon's house, modeled in my new Atlantis, and I can hope, my lords, that my midnight studies to make our countries flourish and outbie European neighbors in mysterious and beneficent arts have not so ingratefully affected the whole intellects, that you will delay or resist his majesty's desires, and my humble petition in this benevolent, yea, magnificent affair, since your honorable posterities may be enriched thereby, and my ends are only to make the world my heir, and the learned fathers of my Solomon's house, the successive and sworn trustees in the dispensation of the great service, for God's glory, my prince's magnificence, the Parliament's honor, our country's general good, and the propagation of my own memory. Which done, I shall not then doubt the happy issue of my undertakings, in this design, whereby concealed treasures, which now seem utterly lost to mankind, shall be confined to so universal a piety, and brought into use by the industry of converted penitents, for midnight studies, works in darkness or secret projects should be read. The sworn trustees were, of course, the members of his esoteric group. The concealed treasures were his discoveries toward truth, and the converted penitents were those not initiated into the mysteries, although it is usual to assume that they were convicts exported to work in the plantation. Until the formation of the Virginia Company, the Jamestown settlement was a tragic example of short-sightedness and mismanagement. The colonizers were drawn principally from the gentile classes and were totally unequipped to carve out their destinies in the wilderness. Among the early arrivals were jewelers and a perfumer. Several were fortune hunters, and all would come to a bad end had not Captain John Smith been a rough and ready soldier, whose exploits included warfare against the Turks in Transylvania. Among these assorted gentles, there were some with capabilities suitable for the transference to the Western Hemisphere of the projects designed by the wits of Gray's Inn. After the Jamestown settlement gained some semblance of order and performance, descendants of those men who formed the original Baconian society left England and settled in the colony. It was through them that the great plan began to operate in America. There were most fortuitous marriages between the families of the original custodians of the philosophical legacy, from the minglings of the bloods of the Bacons, the Wattons, the Dunns, the Herberts, and the Moores. The Virginia colony derived many of its prominent citizens. Lord Bacon guided the project and probably outlined the program to be followed after his death. The Reverend M.F. Carey, associate of the Philosophical Society of Great Britain, writes, "We are furnished with no documentary evidence of the introduction of Freemasonry into the United States, but it appears that it had an existence there as early as the year 1606. Charles H. Mertz supports the belief that certain Masonic activities must be assigned to the period between 1600 and 1620. He writes, "There is so much to indicate that the period of Bacon was the beginning of a secret floor work, an idea that afterwards, imperfectly understood, was welded to the operative or guild system and became the curious Anderson and de Zarger's mixture of 1723. Someone must have drawn freely from such works as Utopia, Atlantis, Campanella, Shakespeare, the Bible, and other sources for the curious conglomeration of Rosicrucian, religious, mystic, and operative laws, rules, and government that our ritual presents. The Bacon family itself was well represented in Virginia, both by name and by blood. It has been usual to trace the Bacons of Virginia from Robert Bacon of Drinkston, Suffolk, who was the father of the good Sir Nicholas Bacon, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. Sir Nicholas' brother James Bacon had a son, Sir James Bacon, who died in 1618. Sir James was the father of Nathaniel Bacon, the elder, whose grandson was Nathaniel Bacon, the rebel, who led the Bacon Rebellion in Virginia. Nathaniel, the elder brother, had a brother, the Reverend James Bacon, whose son, also named Nathaniel Bacon, came to Virginia in 1650 and settled at Kings Creek in York County. This Nathaniel was a sober and thoughtful man who concerned himself considerably in the affairs of his uneasy cousin, Nathaniel the Rebel. Both of the Nathaniels have been referred to by historians as Lord Bacon's kinsmen. The private records do not agree entirely with the accepted genealogy, but this supplies enough material to demonstrate the natural and available channels for the transference of Lord Bacon's projects and remains to Virginia. Nathaniel the Rebel, 1647 to 1676. Graduated at Cambridge and studied law at the Inns of Court. He married in 1674 and sailed for Virginia the same year. He had ample financial resources, secured several estates, was socially prominent, and was appointed to the governor's council. When Governor Berkeley refused to protect the colonists from the neighboring Indian tribes, young Bacon took the field in defiance of the governor's pleasure. A feud approaching revolution resulted, which ended by Nathaniel Bacon and his followers burning the Jamestown settlement. The episode is referred to historically as Bacon's Rebellion, and it has been said that the occurrence played an important part in the formation of the American national consciousness. Bacon's career as a rebel lasted about 20 weeks, and he is supposed to have died of poison or malaria October 1st, 1676, while campaigning. The circumstances of his death are obscure, and his body was buried in an unmarked grave to prevent Governor Berkeley from ordering the corpse to be dug up and publicly hanged. There is more to this story than has ever been told. Bacon's rebellion took place exactly 100 years before the colonies of America declared themselves to be a free and independent nation in 1776. The causes of the rebellion and revolution were similar, if not identical. In 1676, Bacon, the rebel, said, "But if there be, as sure there is, a just God to appeal to, if religion and justice be a sanctuary here, if to plead the cause of the oppressed, if sincerely to aim at his majesty's honor and the public good without any reservation or by interest, if to stand in the gap after so much blood of our dear brethren bought and sold, if after the loss of a great part of his majesty's colony deserted and dispeopled freely with our lives and estates to save the remainder, be treason, God Almighty judge and let guilty die." Although Bacon, the rebel, was certainly an impetuous young man, his cause was just and his sentiments precisely those of his noble kinsman. Governor Berkeley represented the same entrenched tyranny against which the Universal Reformation had been fashioned and perfected. In justice, however, it should be noted that Berkeley was summoned to explain his conduct. The king refused him audience and is credited with saying, "That old fool has hanged more men in that naked country than I have done for the murder of my father." Berkeley died the following year of vexation. As settlements by the Spanish, Dutch, French, and English increased in number and size, no political, philosophical, or mystical sect of Western Europe was without members or sympathizers among the colonizers. Europe was aflame with new ideals affecting every department of human activity. Old world theories became new world practices. Reactionaries and progressives arrived together, but found no substantial reconciliation. Nonconformists continued to be persecuted and found it necessary to seek refuge in the wilderness or among friendly Indian tribes. Little has been made of these dissensions, and the dissenters themselves have been traditionally regarded as troublesome. It is difficult to restore the pattern of submerged activities, covering a period when historical records were scanty and subject to destruction. It is certain, however, that between 1610 and 1660, a mass of material concerned with the development of the Great Plan for America was transferred from Europe to the Western continent for preservation and future use. It is shallow thinking to assume that the secret societies operating in Europe, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and the Fellows of the Royal Society, had no representation among the colonies until the beginning of the 18th century. The confusion is due not to the lack of such activity, but the inadequacy of available records. Reverend Edward Patterson, in his History of Rhode Island, page 101, refers to a Masonic document found in America which says, "In the spring of 1658, Mordecai Caponal, Moses Pacico, Levi, and others, in all 15 families, arrived at Newport, America, from Holland. They brought with them the first 3 degrees of Masonry, and worked them in the house of Capeunal, and continue to do so, they and their successors, to the year 1742. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies.